Okay, so we are going to go on now to talk more specifically about the relationships among language, culture, and identity. And one thing that we need to be aware of, I think we somewhat talked about last time about something called cultural. I think some of you talked about identity crisis, culture shock. So this is where this it comes out. So when we talk about culture or how we get accustomed to a new culture, that's where we talk about the process of acculturation. So acculturation refers to the process of adjusting and adapting to a new culture, typically when living within the culture. So you get absorbed to a culture and you get acculturated into the second culture, the C2 culture, often resulting in the development of a new or hybrid cultural identity. So we often talk about how our identity would eventually change depending on the context that we get ourselves immersed into, and one being a new culture. Culture shock, I think you might have heard about this wording before, right? Or a term where you receive this type of shock by exposing yourself to a new culture. So this refers to a phenomenon that may occur during the process of acculturation, involving feelings such as irritability, confusion, anxiety, depression, or even a deeper psychological crisis caused by the unfamiliarity of the new cultural environment. So while acculturation just refers to the whole process of getting accustomed to, without including the negative and positive experiences, all sorts, and acculturation process, culture shock is one shock that students or learners or any individual experience during that process of acculturation. So you can let's say you can explain the culture shock that exists within the acculturation process. But as you can tell from this description, culture shock is oftentimes described to be negative. Why do you think that, or when do you think culture shock could be detrimental to a person? Or do you have any experience of having this type of culture shock?
So in Western country, it is natural to get into the house uh with the shoes on.
Yeah.
So it was kind of culture shock to me.
So in Western certain countries, I think I had the same experience that you just walk in with your shoes on. But in Korea, we usually take our shoes off. So that's another one. Have you guys been to like a hotel in other countries? Or I don't know if we also have it in Korea, but if there's a bed and you see like a blanket on the bottom, have you guys seen them? Like there's a blanket, there's a pillow, and there's a full blanket. Do you know what the use of this blanket is for?
As the cover from the shoes.
Yes. So if you just want to get on the bed with your shoes on, this is where your shoes would rest, right? So you don't get your bed dirty, but it's okay to get the blanket dirty. So if you want to stay safe, I guess, don't try to use this blanket to cover yourself, okay? When you go abroad. So that could be an example of culture shock that you get to experience that there are these differences. But when do you think it reaches the level of shock? Because if you just go to a hotel and experience, oh, this seems to be something that is different in this culture or this environment. But if you have to stay in that context for a long time, and if this type of difference is not just one incident, but it causes or it is a series of differences that you get to be somewhat very confused or irritated, then in that case, it might be called culture shock. But I think we can all agree that it somewhat stems from the differences amongst cultures, right? And for example, Korea is a very fast-paced country, right? You get to sign up for an internet service and you get it done within a day or two. But if you go to other countries, like for example, in like European countries, it takes like about a month, right, to get something actually done or get it installed. So in those cases, we have different expectations even with this getting an installment on your internet service. So therefore, if it is collected all together, then it might cause people a culture shock. But I think another thing to note about culture shock is that it could be how should I say it? Some people would overcome this culture shock and go through the acculturation process. But however, some people might just get sick of it, that they decide to leave the country, right? You might actually find people coming back, right, from abroad, deciding that they would not continue to live abroad. And those might be the result of culture shock. So people have different reactions to this type of culture shock. Do you think culture shock could occur within one culture, like within the same country, for example? Can you think about any other example?
I had culture shock when I came here and met people from different cities of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a very big country, so every city is like almost like its own state. It's different mentalities. So I think I had more culture shock from that than from Indian culture.
Yeah. So even like, for example, when you enter your undergraduate studies, like enter universities, you get to meet people from all other areas of the same country, even, right? And from that experience, you'll be able to get, oh, these people are very different from where I used to come from, right? So that's another experience. Another thing that you might have easily experienced is that from high school to university, your whole curriculum actually changes, right? I think some students might have just followed the strict, stable, somewhat of a course schedule. And as you enter a university, you decide on how you're going to schedule your own timetable. So in those cases, you might be able to find that there are these culture shock that we don't get to realize consciously, but there are these moments that even exist in our daily lives in the same culture. So there are four successive stages of a cultural acquisition that is described to occur. The first stage is called honeymoon stage. As you can tell from the wording honeymoon, it's all pink and rosy. That this is the initial period of excitement and euphoria about the new surroundings. So once you go to enter a new culture, you get to see the benefits, or you get to see what's so good about it, or what's so appealing. Then you move on to the second stage, which is called culture shock stage. So this is a period where you receive cultural stress and often involving a loss of self-esteem and a sense of security. When you talk about sense of security in your own culture, the first culture, the C1, you know what's going on, right? You know how to play the role within that culture, but suddenly you're thrown into something that is different, then you feel the loss of that sense of security anymore because you don't know how to navigate in this new culture. Then the third stage comes in once you survive the culture shock stage, which is called the recovery stage. So gradual adjustment to new ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving happens. So then you get to understand, okay, so I guess this is the way people behave in this culture because of such and such reasons. So you be able to make certain connections. And finally, the fourth stage is called the adaptation or integration stage, where you accept the new hybrid identity of yours, and there is this increased comfort within the new culture. So there are supposed to be these four different stages that occur. And if you are able to look at the slides, I want you to take a look at the three models that I've included that are somewhat introduced in the culture learning. So what I want you to do with your neighbors is to go over the three models and think about which one you like the most, or which one do you think is stressed, which idea is stressed the most in this one particular model, and think about which one you think or you agree most with it or disagree most with it. So with your partner, let's take about 5 minutes to go over these three models, and then we'll wrap up and talk about them together. So you guys can just turn and get two. Okay. Tina, would you like to look at the news?
It's not really.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's been up. Yes, yes. Very linear, and I guess like you stress, you adapt, and you meet some new stress. That's vital. Yes, adaptation. What about that one? But social and personal social authority, awareness of public funds and cultures. I think we should stay on that.
The first one, I'm not sure. Most first, century. Worry about this.
이제와 해결됐다 이거. 너네 해결 어쨌든 그런 되려고 해서 제가 봤을 때 이렇게 올라갔다 내려오려고 접했다가 yes, 이게 약간 이쪽에 있었다면 막 계속 얘기하고 일어나면서 사이즈 쓰고 하면서 서서히 정답이 안 와서
So it's on the different like
그래서 킹스 모델이 있었는데 약간 좀 뭐라 해야 되지?
dislike some kind of
그런 단계들을 모색하는 걸로 볼 수 있어요. 시행착오가 좀 들어가는 것 같아요.
The best part. That was the most detailed. Yes.
Which one is right?
Yeah, I don't think the risk is like a lot of people. And but I feel like many people like now that understanding a second or this they're valued like they like they lose their mind. They want to get out of it.
But do you think that rational
Is that there is like unacceptable?
But they have to have it
So they
like if they saw something that
still kind of feeling personal and conscious.
and try to change the risk
You can
have the open mind. They works other way around. No, we can, exactly, not assimilating themselves to the target. That's very interesting. You think people they related to that? That's. Yeah, I think
there's actually no such option as like
it goes
not being assimilated or adapted, right?
It can be very strict. Yeah, very strong. Because they, like in their mind, they think that they're gonna get like I don't know how to describe it, but they're gonna be good human if they made the what people like them. Yeah, I think that's somewhat common in across several religions. Yeah. that they're trying to give you like this is something that you need good for you. And therefore something that I created, I want the people around me like who I love also. But
I think like the one that I'm talking about there is because they're very different. Yeah, in that case, like they don't accept others. They just want them to get,
That's that.
Yeah.
Interesting how you pointed to religion.
Yeah.
이런 결과가 있으면 그 관계가
I feel like it's responsibility it also assumes very conscious process of putting into perspective the strengths and weaknesses of culture and investing in appreciating and valuing specific aspects, but for example, okay, like interacting for a long time with culture. Still not like really trying to do things meaningful. And then you are realize strengths and weaknesses, right? Overall, I like how it's all forward about that. And most of culturalism is culturalism. But I think it's just my opinion of some buildings that cross-cultural learning should be.
It's interesting that KCL starts with those strokes.
Yeah.
Like they could from here.
I think it has something with doing with the honey. Like you at the beginning, you're very happy. You don't even realize how much the difference there. And then when you start living there, it's actually getting.
Just circle, at first circle.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So I think the growth, everyone regard it as not the growth first stage.
Getting.
I feel like social person have straight down, you get down, and then go down and stress, you get down. It's like nothing how so right, I think this person was like that. Like in the same circle, you have one without so stress was not. I think that's right. Yes, I do also. Like I think you're going like I don't know, people and next one would be first that was stuck in the middle and the first year culture. We don't pursue
Actually.
like we were not ever exposed to any other we don't pursue the yes like therefore all these it's not about how you strange so we kind of have like nothing very important in a new environment like and then maybe we create that.
Okay, so let's talk about the figure together. It seems like you all had like a really interesting discussion while what's going around and eavesdropping. So let's talk about the three models. There are more than these three, by the way, but going over the three, which one did you like the most, or any other general thoughts related to it, or anything that you did not like? Any comments? Yeah. No.
Well, because the adaptation or operation is not a single step. It repeat and repeat.
Mhm.
Adaptation and thread because even if we don't we adapt it to the culture, but we can get thread from the other section. So it repeat adaptation and thread and at last it goes to positive way to adaptation. I like this.
Okay, so I think a lot of students resonated or liked this particular one because it includes that spiral movement where it goes back and forth between stress and adaptation. But eventually, unless you stop in the middle, there is going to be a continuation of growth in the individual's identity construction. So I think regarding that point, I think a lot of the main idea that this particular figure was trying to reflect was this idea of going back and forth. That it's not always going to be a linear process where it's going to be all development, but that there are going to be these threats where it's going to hold back sometimes. In terms of the development stage, it could just be stalled, like stopped or suspended for a while, but then afterwards it would continue. However, this particular figure, it does not really grasp the pace though, right? It talks about the overall growth, but when you think about the pace, that it looks quite uniform, I think, but sometimes the growth could happen quite fast compared to the other levels too. So I think, but still, this particular model is trying to highlight that there's this spiral movement.
I have a question about that figure. When we look at the close, it's not actually a spiral, but a separate ellipses, right?
Separate ellipses. Oh, that's
It's not spiral. So
Oh,
I'm just wondering if it's just a misdrawn or intended.
that might be a person who did not major in scientific or with the graph. I think this person, I mean, I'm not Kim, so I can't really say what the intention was, but I think the overall intention was to talk about the movement. But next time I try to figure out a fancy figure, I'll contact you for review so that I don't get this type of comment. But I think that's an interesting point. Another group, in fact, talked about that sometimes you might actually have a different point of view, and I appreciate that this idea of going backwards in terms of growth, right, might in fact not be true. Like that, even though you experience stress, you might still be in the process of developing. So I think it's fine that you have like different opinions about the point, but I think overall in general, I think Kim's figure was just trying to say that there are going to be these movement that goes back and forth between stress and adaptation, not just a linear process. Good. How about anything else? So we just went over this one. So how about this HOOPS model?
Our two personally thought it was the best one because it gave like 4 different outcomes, and every other model it gave like only kind of one outcome. But I personally don't know about some of the in-between stages. I don't think that they're necessary, but that they happen to every individual or that they happen like consciously, especially about like appreciation and valuing. Yeah. And ethnocentrism also was interesting how like it assumes that for everyone it starts with ethnocentrism. I'm also not sure if that is true for like every individual.
Oh, yeah, I think we talked about ethnocentrism when we talked about like I think week 2 or 3 about human learning in general, where babies would usually be very ethnocentric, where they would be or egocentric. I would have to say that they're focused on themselves. I think it's somewhat natural for us to be accustomed to the way that we were brought up with and imagine that other people would behave the same way. I think that's another reason why we fight a lot with other people. I mean, I don't know a lot. I'm talking about my husband, but we fight quite a lot because I think about things or I think about what you should do in this type of context because of such and such reasons, but he might have a completely different idea because of his own upbringing, right? So we are 2 different cultures clashing, although it seems like the one culture, right? So I think that's one. But yes, this particular figure describes the end product in 4 different kinds of ways. But in addition to that, it tries to talk about something that goes within yourselves, right? Acceptance, understanding, and appreciation and such and such, which you cannot necessarily tell a lot of the times because it might not, you can't really say, I appreciate this, I appreciate it, right? Or I understand, I'm aware. You don't necessarily say it out loud unless you will really want to get that attention. But so this model is somewhat describing what's going underneath. But in addition to that, what do you think about the challenges that, or some things that you might want to change about this, or something that you might criticize about this process? Any idea? If you had to, an opportunity to change this, how would you change it? Yes.
Final stage, it's mostly talking about some ideal situations. There can be some situations where someone cannot really adapt to another culture, maybe. So that kind of other situation can be added up to it.
Yes. This particular figure, you don't necessarily see failure, right? You don't necessarily find struggle. It seems all very accepting, understanding, right? So I think in another group, they talked about how it seems like this is following a very, I guess, pink and rosy picture of how it should be. Do you want to add something?
And because the graph shows the process of attention like a linear process.
Yes.
But I think it's not linear because we're in the stage of appreciation and we find something odd. And we came back to understanding one other.
Yes. So there's no going back and forth, as you just said, that it's only going through like understanding, appreciation, and just one way. However, as we can tell that we often go through these challenges or struggles or difficulties, and those are missed in this particular figure. So it's actually very good that you guys were able to point that out. Okay, so next we are going to do a very short, interesting activity that I find is going to be, you're going to take some time to draw. So yeah, drawing. I don't think you have been drawing that much, but what you're going to do is you can draw on your pads if you want to, or if you have like a paper and a pen and pencil, you can also draw. What I want you to write is, I didn't write the prompt here. What you're going to do is on the left-hand side in the left column, try to draw yourself before learning or before mastering your second language. Okay, or second culture or second language. After, in the after section, try to draw yourself, imagine that you have mastered the language or culture, and try to draw yourself after mastering the language. So it could be English, it could be any other languages that you're trying to learn. So try to draw 2 images before and after mastering the language. I know that this can be very difficult, especially for Kai students, but try to take some time and do a little bit of drawing, and we'll talk about your drawing afterwards. So this is somewhat related to my own research area, so I'm very looking forward to what you draw. So now comes the more of the embarrassing time. You're going to share your drawings with your partners and describe what you tried to depict in the differences between the 2 drawings, okay? And then we'll talk about them in whole group, okay? So go back to your group and just try to share what you have tried to draw, or have tried to attempt to describe, and then we will unfold your discussion. Okay, so how was it? How was drawing for, I don't know, I told you how occasionally that you draw, but when I was going around, I was able to find that I think there's like a Thai style of drawing. That when you try to draw like almost like a skeleton, there seems to be these like I don't know, ways of drawing that we can actually say that's like Kaishen drawing. But one thing that I wanted to mention was that so a long time ago, I did this research related to looking at this, we call it something called imagined learner identity. What that means is when we talk about identity of ourselves, we not only think about our identity at the current moment, but especially related to language learning, it's connected to our imagination of what that language is going to bring us. So through the acquisition of the language, we'd be able to, let's say, get ourselves into the imagined community. We talked about community of practice last time. So it's like very similar when we talk about imagined identity. So this is one type of research that this is a very easy one, where we look at the before-after transformation and try to understand what students or what language learners are trying to achieve through the learning of that language. So what I have overall found were that there were eventually 5 different dimensions, and I saw them in yours as well. One is psychological. One is usually people get happy after mastering the language. But interestingly, what I also found from another student's work was that you can actually have a more of a critical view where you can say that you're happy inside in your happy place before, but then through the learning of the language, it gets you out to the world where you might in fact experience something that is negative or that presents us challenges. So it could go both ways, but usually we found that the psychological development happens from bad to good. Another one, physical. I think some of you have drawn physical development that it's actually very interesting that in the past, a lot of students describe that through learning language, they get prettier. And that was very interesting. Like they suddenly grow, like they get taller, they get skinnier, and they have like they're suddenly wearing like high heel shoes. And it's very interesting how we describe the physical development, right, across the before and after. The third one has to do with job, vocational. So a lot of you have also described that through the learning or mastering the language, suddenly you become from student to lecturer or professor, right? So your position actually changes over time. The other one was related to the relationship that you're also supposed to build. A lot of you have also pointed to the arrows, right? A lot of students also use metaphorical descriptions where you are somewhat inside, not mesmerized, but you are somewhat immersed in your own environment, comfortable environment, but now you are having like an open attitude towards the world. So there were those. Another one was more of the critical view that you get to have like more of a critical perspective on the outside as well as yourself. So there's a reflective one. I'm going to just share one of the work that another student has done before. It looks very fancy, right? I mean, this I have to say that they had more time and they had crayons. So I imagine that your drawings would also be very different if you had crayons and more time, right? Anyway, so this one over here, I mean, when we do this type of analysis on the images, we not only look at who the protagonist is. Here we can tell that this is the protagonist where she says me. And again, we have another person who says over here, me. Her hair got shorter and she actually got smaller. So that's another difference here. But we pay attention to other elements highlighted. For example, over here on the bottom, do you think she is engaged in this image or in this conversation? How can we tell that she is just a passenger or bystander?
She's looking the other.
Yeah. So we look at the direction, like the eye contact that these drawings make to the other characters or to the readers of the image. But this person is making no eye contact and then she's just walking by while this girl, the me, is looking at her. And we also have something in the word bubble. We look at the word bubbles, whether it's being spoken or it's being in the word bubble. So here she said, what should I say? And it just remains. So it's not vocalized. So we also pay attention to what is being spoken or what is not being spoken, but remains in thought. Another one is the looking at the distance amongst people. So the looking at how far each characters are from one another, and we can kind of tell what that is trying to highlight in terms of the message that is portrayed in this type of image. Another thing that you might find is that multinational friends over here, especially this one, you can say that this person's back is toward us, the readers, right? Which is, in other words, stressing that this person is much more engaged in this conversation between the three of them, rather than presenting these characters to us. So we can associate a lot of meanings related to body gestures, as well as the characters that students draw, and in addition to what you have drawn as well. So what we are going to do now is I'm going to, we don't have that much time. Okay. Another language, I actually brought you guys textbooks so that we'd be able to do some sort of culture, how culture was treated. But we might do this next week because next week is also going to be about intercultural communicative competence. So I think I'll bring these back so that we'd be able to take a look at the actual textbooks that were published before. So another thing I just wanted to share with you is this type of textbooks and how textbooks present us with understanding of learner identity as well as the intercultural communication or cultural adaptation. I would have to say, where would you find this type of text? By the way, this is translation. It was originally in Korean. So who do you think this textbook was for, or at which level of proficiency? This is a Korean learning textbook. Chapter 7 in Korean. This is the second level, I think. Chapter 5 from the second level.
Is it for adult learners?
Adult learners. Anything else?
I think that's the beginning of.
At the beginning level.
Okay. At the beginning.
At the very beginning, okay. Adult beginner level, Korean learner. Anything else that we can kind of get from this textbook?
Involves culture.
It involves culture, okay. Cultural ideas are there. Do you think this is targeting male learners or female learners? Female learners? What do you think might be the reason why you think that it's targeting female learners?
Sport.
It has more female. Yeah. It has more females. Yes, actually, the main character here called Suzanne is also the main character. There are, if you look at the introduction of the characters, there are 4 female characters. Suzanne comes from the Philippines. I think there are 3 others coming from China, Thailand, Vietnam, I think. So there are the 4 characters involved. So it's interesting how you interpreted that this particular textbook seems to be the one that is providing Korean lessons for a very beginner level students who are female and who seems to be getting an idea of what cultural background of the Korean context is. The main title of this textbook is called, I forgot the whole title, but it's actually the text of the Korean learning for international marriage immigrants. So it's for marriage immigrants. 결혼 이민자를 위한 Korean, okay? But as you can tell that it looks very much like geared toward female, right? The reason why we decided to study this textbook was I have a friend of mine who got married to a Korean woman. So he comes from the United States and he was learning Korean through this book. And he was showing me, he was like, look at what I'm learning. And I was looking through the book and I was like, this is so interesting. This is so not suitable for you. And because the chapters are talking about making kimchi, for example. And if you take a look at this particular one, it has this whole idea of this Suzanne doing, like it's Suzanne's day, right?
Yes.
What her day looks like, a typical day looks like. What she does is she wakes up and then she eats her breakfast and then goes to school, learn Korean, and then meets her friend and eat lunch in the restaurant and eat kimbap, and then come back, clean, do the laundry. And then I eat together with my husband. So each one is described with the image on top. Do you see any mismatch between what's described here and what's on the top? So what we did here was to pay attention to this description over here. I meet a friend at 1:20 and eat lunch, which seems to be apples, in the restaurant, right? So she's eating with her friend, as we can tell. At 7 p.m., she says that she's eating dinner with her husband. But is she really eating dinner in the image?
Yeah.
Yes, she seems like she's more of a serving the dinner rather than eating. Here she's eating, but even though we have the word together included in the final one, it seems like she's mostly doing the serving related to the eating of her, the eating is done by her husband. And in addition to that, we see apron, right? So when we look at these type of textbook and do something called multimodal analysis, we pay attention to the color, the type of clothing that these characters wear, and what these characters actually do. On the right-hand side, this is again Suzanne. She looks very different, but she and her husband are talking. about getting accustomed to Korean culture. So when you take a look at this, and we talked about acculturation process, where do you think the acculturation comes in? From Suzanne's point, or do you think the husband is supposed to go through the acculturation in the discourse? When you take a look at the conversation, they're talking about the mother-in-law and the challenge that Suzanne experienced with her mother-in-law. The husband saying that mother seemed to be in a bad mood. Is there something wrong? And Suzanne said, I woke up late this morning. Since I frequently overslept, she scolded me this afternoon. Husband said, did you talk back to her? Suzanne said, no, I was just listening to her talk. But after she looked at my face, she suddenly got angry. So husband said, is that so? Did you make direct eye contact? Suzanne says, yes, that's how you're supposed to behave when an older person is talking. So this is someone pointing to Suzanne's upbringing, right? So this is how our C1 is done. The husband says, in Korea, you should not look straight at the elderly when being scolded. It's considered impolite. Suzanne says, now I know why mother got angry. I can't get used to Korean culture no matter how much I try. I should quickly apologize to her. The last line suggests that Suzanne is going to quickly apologize to her mother-in-law, right? What this is someone suggesting is the direction of the cultural learning. So in this type of dialogue, it could in fact happen between the husband and the mother-in-law talking about what has happened, and husband saying that, no, in Philippines, this is the way, blah, blah, blah. But it seems like direction of cultural learning is going to happen from Suzanne's end. So we have this understanding, like when we look at these type of textbook, we can kind of get like, so who's going to change through this learning? So, and it's more usually one direction. So it's usually the learner, the marriage immigrants who are expected to learn about the Korean culture and get acculturated. So we can find a lot of these very detailed the differences between the attitudes related to cultural learning in textbooks too. So next class, when we come back, and I will share some of the textbooks that we actually looked at, and we can talk about how culture was treated and how intercultural communicative competence is supposed to occur, how we had different points of view depending on when it was published. Okay, so let's move on to the last few slides very quickly. So talking about culture, we also have something called social distance, which refers to the cognitive and affective proximity between two cultures that come into contact within an individual. According to Schumann, language aptitude or intelligence is not the only factor in successful second language learning. The degree of social distance between cultures may also influence L2 learning outcomes. What this suggests is that depending on the distance between cultures, for example, Korean culture being somewhat close to Japanese culture, then it might be easier for the learners to learn about the second culture, although there might be still differences. So that's what social distance refers to. However, this social distance could be also perceived social distance, how we perceive it. So the perceived social distance refers to not the actual distance or the objectively measured distance, but it's rather the proximity that the individual have in terms of the similarities or the distance between the two cultures. The final optimal distance model shows the hypothesis that adult learners who fail to achieve proficiency in a second language that may have difficulty synchronizing their linguistic and cultural development. So there's this optimal distance that suggests that there could be this type of hypothesis that exists. So I think almost the final. Regarding attitude is another very interesting point, another interesting factor that comes into learning, especially both learning languages and cultures. But this refers to a set of personal feelings, beliefs, or biases toward races, cultures, ethnic groups, social groups, and languages. These attitudes can be both positive and negative, right? We talked about stereotypes, and stereotypes was something that is very strict, not strict, somewhat concrete in a way, but attitudes could be both positive and negative. These attitudes influence how individuals perceive and interact with others, and in language learning, attitudes can affect motivation, participation, and overall success. I think this is the reason why at the during the model of cultural learning, we have this understanding. I think a lot of the times we're talking about something, this seems to be something that is hidden. That is because these are somewhat all connected to the attitudes of the learners, right? The attitudes of being aware, attitudes of understanding, and attitudes of accepting. So attitude is a very important factor in language learning. And finally, this is another English as a lingua franca, the international lingua franca that I wanted to talk about, or some people use the word world Englishes nowadays, or I think you might have heard the expression called global language, English as a global language. And when we talk about the nativization, it refers to the indigenization of a language. What was once a second language in a culture evolves into a language accepted as native or standard. So a lot of times people imagine nowadays, especially in the globalized world, English is somewhat becoming used not only as a second language, but also used as something that a lot of students might claim to be native in. Right. So you reach the level of that mastery that you be able to consider yourself having a native proficiency in the language. One of the key terms that I think some of you might be familiar with is called native, non-native, right? Have you heard about that before? Like, oh, somebody speaks like a native speaker, right? Somebody speaks like a non-native speaker of the language. This term in our background in language learning field has been controversial for so long that people eventually try to avoid using that term. So there is not really, because oftentimes people were talking about how there's a native speaker norm that people are trying to achieve but never can get to. So people were trying to say that there's no such thing as a native speaker norm. There are just users of the language, right? So I think that confronts with this idea of native or standard. So in 1988, I think, I'm not completely sure, but Castro came up with these three circles. Castro talked about how English was used differently in the three circles and decided that there is the inner circle countries which use English as the most common language, the first languages of a lot of the citizens, and the outer circle, including Malaysia, India, Pakistan, Philippines, and Singapore, expanding circle, including Korea, China, Israel, Nepal, and so on. So what this Castro was trying to do was that how English was treated or how English was used differently in these type of countries and try to group them into one. So we had the inner circle countries, including these six countries, no, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the rest for the outer and expanding circles. However, again, as you can tell, that this type of organization always gets confrontation by saying, but this does not necessarily describe the changing boundaries that we often find in our changing world. So therefore, this became soon abandoned in a way, but still it's used to get at least an idea of how English was treated or how English is being learned or is being used in different contexts. So it gives us a nice window into how the languages could be understood in terms of the users or the use or the purposes for learning. So I just wanted to quickly go over them and to let you know what this looked like in terms of the three circles. Okay, so that's about it for, I think, today's class. And one last announcement related to your weekly reflection. Number 4, we only have one last. I think we have one coming up in a couple of weeks. What you're going to do is we're going to reflect on your cultural factors, okay? So how cultural factors influence your language learning experience, how your feelings or behaviors changed over time. So you're going to start thinking about the cultural experiences that you had and how that has influenced you. In your response, you can consider the following questions. How did cultural factors play a role in terms of cultural differences, social distance, attitudes, or stereotypes? Any one of them is fine. And afterwards, did you experience any changes over time? Increased confidence or reduced anxiety or culture shock stages, any type of experience that you have gone through. And other than that, I think that's it for today's class.